Hello everyone, welcome to Marion's World. I'm Marion and today I'm going to be going through the sorts of equipment, supplies, the threads, the fabrics, the things you'll need if you are wanting to start doing embroidery. And normally today would be an episode of my stitch journal, and it's just gone on pause for 1 week because I get asked questions about needles, about thread, about the hoops I use, all different sorts of things, and I've been wanting to address it for a while, and I decided that today was an ideal day. I hope this is going to be helpful for you whether you're new to stitching or whether you're not. And obviously it's all just my own personal point of view. I'm not trained, nobody's ever told me anything, it's just years of experience, and so hopefully I'm going to pass that on to you. And what you won't find me saying is these are essential things, these are the things you must have. There's a lot of prescriptive stuff out there saying you have to have this or you have to have that equipment, and I won't be saying any of that. I will just be encouraging you to get something, start stitching and go from there. First is something to stitch on, and you can buy fabric, you can buy beautiful fabric, but you might not, if you're a beginner, you might not even know that you're going to enjoy it. You might like the idea, but you might not know. So I've got some fabrics here. This has obviously been a bought one. It's an even weave canvas that would be suitable for counted thread work, so something like any of the canvas work stitches. You could do counted cross stitch on that. It is quite fine. This was thrifted. I don't think I've ever actually used it. This is linen, it's oatmeal linen. I bought this a very long time ago. It is an even weave Irish linen. There is around about 40 threads to the square inch. What it means is that it's very soft. You can get a needle easily through it, and if I pick a needle up, you can see that my needle goes in and out beautifully. That's not going to be any problem in stitching. In fact, I would suggest to you that if you're able to take a needle with you when you're looking for fabric, and that you can needle the fabric, you don't have to have thread in it, you will see whether it's something you can stitch through or not. So you can see that that's lovely and soft. That's with a big needle. Here's a finer needle, beautifully going through. So that's even weave Irish linen. So they're examples of what you would be looking for. You'd be looking for something soft, something that's not a high thread count, something that's nice in your hand and easy to stitch. If you've been on my channel before, you'll know that I work mostly with thrifted fabric, and so this is a couple of things that I look for when I'm looking for fabric to stitch on. The first, even though that's green, it's actually an old sheet. It's a cotton sheet. Again, I can take my needle, I can see whether it's going to be nice to stitch through. That's actually a little more difficult, and you can see that it's leaving a hole where that needle comes through. So sometimes I quite often use these as backing fabrics. Try with the finer needle. The finer needle is going through there nicely. So if I was going to be embroidering on that, I'd probably be using it for something that I was only going to use a couple of threads with. Wouldn't be using that to take 6 strands of floss through. It's too tight a weave, but also they're good for backing fabrics. That's been a really good fabric in its day. It's got a high thread count, good for backing other things, but you wouldn't be wanting to take your wool through there, I don't think. It just wouldn't be suitable. Well, this is the one I'm doing my stitch tutorials on a Friday. This is vintage tablecloth. It is about 40 threads to the inch, because I've counted them for you. And again, it is leaving a little hole, but it's so much easier than that other fabric. And a fine embroidery needle, no problem at all. Nice and soft in your hand, less threads, nice to use. You can buy thrifted material. This is a pair of linen trousers, and it's a lovely bright yellow colour. and I have bought that specifically because I thought it would be good for stitching on. It's linen, it's not cotton. The needle goes in and out like it wasn't even there. Beautiful stitching. I could over dye them, you could put them in T&T dye it. That would make a beautiful background for any embroidery. If you haven't tried embroidery before and you're looking to just try it out and see whether it's something you like, I would say go and buy some second-hand fabric somewhere. This is where I got the blue fabric for my drawstring bag. It's a child's dress. I cut the skirt off. It's been the most marvellous thing to stitch on. The needle just goes in and out with no problem at all. So I would suggest that if you're looking for just a small amount of a really lovely cloth, have a look at thrifted little girls' dresses. You're going to get a fine fabric, a thin fabric. It doesn't have to just be for practice. This is the sort of thing I stitch on all the time. The other thing that I like to stitch on is wool. There is your normal wool blanket. That happened to be a blue blanket. That was a cream one that I've dyed. Wool is marvellous. It is also marvellous for wool embroidery. So if you're wanting to do some crewel work on wool, it'll look absolutely marvellous. It's going to stitch like a dream. Next, there are wool clothes that you can get. This is a wool skirt. It's got a hole, in fact it's got a couple of holes in it. I bought that specifically to use for embroidery. And the other way of getting some lovely wool in just some small pieces is to have a look to see if you can find sample books. So all of these wool pieces here have come from a sample book. And quite often you can buy these for very little amount of money. The next thing you're going to need are needles. I do regularly get asked, what size needle am I using? And I've got a confession to make here, I usually don't know. I've had needles since I was young, or I've stitched when you just used whatever needle came to hand. If you were stitching with wool, you needed one with a big eye. If you were stitching with embroidery thread, you needed a smaller needle. And usually Mum or Grandma would just pick a needle out of the tin and give you one and you used it, and regardless of what it was called or what the number was. So I actually have no idea what the numbers are at all. Although it's probably really lovely to know, it's easy to get bogged down in things like the numbers, and when really all you need is something that will hold your thread and go through the fabric. And so what I normally say to people is, my little rule is matching the eye of the needle to the thread that you're using, and match the point of the needle to the fabric that you're using. And other than that, you can get long needles and short needles. You can get crewel needles, milliner's needles, betweens, quilting, beading needles. The list is endless. We have crewel needles, and they have a larger eye, and they tend to have a sharpish point, and they're usually not very long, and they're useful for the crewel wool. But you need a long eye to get the thicker thread through. So I would use these for wool, for the pearl cottons, anything that's a bit thick that you need the eye. So the purpose of the eye of the needle is to make the hole that goes through your fabric. So if I wanted to use some wool, if I want to take a piece of that wool, it's going to need to get through the eye of the needle, to bend that over the needle and pull it off and then push it through. But what it's doing is the eye is making the hole in the fabric to pull the thread through. So if I get my little bit of linen again, and if I put the needle in like that, when I pull through, the eye of the needle has to make sufficient of a hole to pull the thickness through, and that is going to, and that's just pulling through beautifully. If I struggle to put that into a smaller needle, but now my needle and the eye are thinner than the actual doubled over yarn, And so what's going to happen now is that when I pull through, which I still will be able to, there's a resistance and I can feel it pulling on the fabric. And what that's going to do is not only make friction on the fabric, but it's going to give friction on your thread. And so your thread is not going to last as long before it starts to go all hairy and not very nice, because what's happening is the eye of the needle isn't making a hole big enough to pull your thread through without that friction. So that's why I would say always matching the eye of the needle to the thickness of your thread. The thicker the thread, the bigger the eye. So the next part of my little rule is that the point of the needle matches the fabric. I'm going to need a sharp point to get through this fabric. There's no point putting a blunt point on there. Here's another needle that's got the same big eye, but it has a blunt end. It does go through, but look what's happening. You need the sharp point to get through this fabric really without destroying the threads. So although I can stitch with it, it's not so successful. This blunt point is more suitable to this fabric because there's already a hole there where the blunt point can go through. Then you have sharps and betweens, which are fine. The eye of the needle is sort of within the shaft of the needle. It doesn't bulge out at all. And so these ones are nice and sharp, nice and fine. You can use maybe up to 3 strands of stranded floss in there. But if you were using 6 strands, I would say that would be too many to go into that, to the eye. You would need a bigger needle. So in my needle book, I tend to have them all, the ones I use all the time are on the front regardless of what they are. And then if I need something else, I go looking through for them. So it is nice to keep your needles in a needle book. It's not an essential thing, but keep your needles arranged, and if it's important to you that you know whether it's a crewel needle or a sharp or a between, you can label your needle book up. So once you've got a fabric and you've got a needle, the next thing you need is some thread to sew with. So I get asked about threads all the time, and so I'm going to go through some of what I have and what I use it for. So here it is. This is about the sum total of the threads that I use. But more than stranded cotton, there are pearl cottons, there are crochet cottons, and there are some arty, slubby things I'll go through in a minute. I have them in colour order and I have them on bobbins. For me, bobbins work well because I like to see all the colours all the time. I like to see my whole lot, so I can go and choose which colour I want to use. And once I've decided on a colour, I can then choose, do I want to use a soft cotton, a stranded cotton? Do I want to use a hand-dyed pearl cotton? I have some linen thread, and there are plenty places where you can go and get threads these days. This whole basket of stranded cotton was bought at a charity shop, and it was, I don't know, it was less than £5 for all of them. There are dozens and dozens of them. And yes, it's probably a cheaper embroidery thread. I don't think it's cotton, or it'll have something else in it. It's very silky, it's very soft, but the amount of colours are beautiful, and I actually mix and match in. It doesn't bother me to put some of this in with some of the more expensive cottons. I would say most of these stranded cottons are probably a mixture of Anchor and DMC, but you can get them in as half-done kits. Look online, you can see people who get rid of embroidery kits that somebody's half done and then got fed up on, and they get rid of them. Not only do you get all the threads, but you'll get some fabric too that you can use or not use, but just harvest it with the supplies. That's my crewel wools. And the last thing I've got here, silk ribbons to sew with, silk waist that's easy, nice to have, and so silk threads. When you're first starting out, just want to get yourself some nice stranded cotton. It's the easiest thing to get hold of, it's easy to use, You can pull the threads out, you can pull nice lengths out. There's usually two ends. One end comes out of the middle of the skein, and if you pull that one, it usually just pulls out no problem and you won't get in a tangle. So always look for the end that's coming from the middle of the skein. So once I've got them from there and I wind them onto my bobbin, then they're ready to use. Normally they would say stitch with fingertips to your elbows. I tend to have a bit longer than that. Depends what you're embroidering and what you want to do. But you can use this in all 6 strands, and you're going to need a bigger eye in your needle to get it through, but lovely effects depending on what you're stitching. It's going to be quick because of the thickness of all the 6 strands. But because they're 6 strands, you can fan them out and you can use as many or as few strands as you want. Or you can see the strands there. So quite often I'm just sewing with 1 strand. Of course that will make a very fine embroidery. It'll take longer to cover the fabric, but it just depends what you're doing. If you are wanting to use, we'll just say 3 strands of floss, and people say floss or thread. I don't think people used to say floss. I don't know whether that's an American term that's come to Britain. I'm not sure actually, but I never used to hear it called floss before. Anyway, I could take that and I could split that down. A better way of doing it is to take each thread individually and just pull. So you just take 1 thread and pull straight up, and you'll find that the thread crumples up under your thumb, but then as soon as it's out, that'll drop down again and you've got 1 strand. And if you do that with each strand, I suppose I want to have 2 strands, I can do that with the next bit as well. And if I put those strands back together and I just smooth them out a bit, when I go to stitch with them, they will lie better. They're not already twisted together. And so by taking them out individually and recombining them, you sort of get rid of that twist and you let the strands of thread lie nicely beside each other. You'd see the effect more if you were doing an area of satin stitch where you wanted the threads to lie side by side. If you've recombined your 2 threads or your 3 threads, you will get a smoother look than if you use it directly from the skein. You can go and buy them new. There are craft shops, hobby shops around where they have huge ranges of skeins for you to go and look at. DMC, which is a French company, Anchor, which used to be, well, originally was Scottish. Beautiful cotton threads. I'm not sure whether these ones, which I think they're probably not 100% cotton, but it doesn't matter. They will stitch. It matters if you want to just use the best stuff. If you want to use the best stuff, you know, go for it. I definitely would buy DMC and Anchor if I was buying them. But if I was starting out, and when I was starting out, I would buy any thread I could get. And if I find them in the thrift shop, I will get anything at all. And so you can build up a stash for quite a reasonable amount of money if you just keep your eyes open. So other than stranded cotton, what's out there? Well, the sky's the limit really. Now, pearl cotton is also cotton. It's made of cotton. Lovely, that's one of my favourite greens. That's a lovely pretty one. So pearl cottons, single strand, not divisible. I absolutely love them. Their thickness is arranged by a number. The basic thing is the smaller the number, the thicker the cotton. So I think I mainly have 8s here. These are probably 8s, and I like them. So it starts at 3, which is the very thickest, and it goes to a 12. So you have 3, 5, 8 and 12. 12 will be the finest. And I have some fine here. That's a lovely fine pearl cotton. And they're very beautiful to stitch with. Really lovely. The other thing to stitch with See these all over the place are crochet cotton, so that's Anchor, perfect for embroidery. So it's a pearl cotton, and then you can get what you would call art type of threads. So this is just a slub, that's the knobbly texture, and it's thick and thin. You can get lovely textural embroidery by using these within your embroidery. So I've got a box here of quite thick stuff that quite often gets used for couching. So there's the linen thread. These sort of boucle yarns, lovely for couching. So they tend to be a bit more expensive because they're a bit unusual. You're not going to probably find them in your likes of Hobbycraft and stuff like that. You'd need to go to a supplier or somebody who's actually dyeing the threads themselves. Useful for all sorts of things, but maybe if you're starting out, that's not the sort of thing you're going to need to buy because you're not going to be doing that sort of a stitching. So if you're really getting into embroidery and you want to up your game and you want some more beautiful yarns, you go to silk. I keep my silk in this little rice bag here, and so I have selections of, well, these are vintage rayon, so it actually says artificial silk. It just means rayon really, but if I stitch with them it'll look like silk when I'm stitching. And this was a lady who dyed her own silk threads, embroidery threads, and they're absolutely gorgeous. I haven't actually used them yet, but I'm looking forward to it. And then of course you go to silk ribbon, and silk ribbon's gorgeous, it really is, and it's really beautiful. It's lovely to embroider with, it's lovely to hold, it's lovely to feel. I keep mine separately in here because I don't have very much. That is virtually all I've got, that's it. Because I've always used polyester silk because I had it and it was what I could afford. And so if you can't afford to get real silk and you're wanting to try some ribbon embroidery, just get the artificial. It's not going to be the end of the world. So both of these pages here, so these foxgloves and the bluebells, they were both stitched with this artificial silk embroidery ribbon, and that's because I bought a whole lot from a haberdashery place that was getting rid of it, and that's got to be 20 years ago, and I've still got huge amounts. And that's why I resisted buying the real silk stuff, because I thought, what am I going to use it for? But it is lovely, and there is a difference. I'm not going to say anything other. There is a difference. However, dependent on what you're wanting to achieve and what you're trying to do, it might not be enough of a difference to make the expense worth it. So those foxgloves were stitched with that thread, that ribbon, and what I did afterwards, because it wasn't the right colour, I touched them with a bit of acrylic paint to get the foxglove colour. The last thread that I want to talk about that you can embroider with is wool. It normally is called crewel wool, and it's to do crewel embroidery. And I think I've had a lot of comments about what it actually is, because I've been doing some crewel embroidery every week. So here's my embroidery wool storage. There are two different types of thread that you can embroider with. The first is tapestry wool. Tapestry wool is a thick 4-ply yarn, and so if I take that and I pull it apart, so 4 threads like that. And this yarn is usually for things like petit point and tapestry on canvas, and I can show you an example. So this is an example of what's called petit point, and it's tent stitch, and you have a regular stitch, and almost like a cross stitch is for embroidery threads. You can do these types of canvas works with a cross stitch or a tent stitch. And this is a cushion that I made a long time ago. It's backed with an old blouse. Anyway, it's a beautiful pattern, but it's lovely, and that's made with tapestry wool. The main yarn that you would use for embroidery is crewel wool. Crewel wool is 2-ply, not 4, like the tapestry is 4-ply, and you can see it's quite a softer look. The crewel wool, you can see the twist more, and it's a finer thread. You can see the difference there in the thickness of the threads. So crewel wool is nearly always, you nearly always see it in the shops as crewel wool, and there are a few different manufacturers. You have DMC and Anchor are just the same, and then quite a well-known one I think these days is Appleton, and I really like them. I think that would be, if I was going to buy new crewel wools today, I would be buying Appleton wools, because I really like them and I like their colours. But all of the ranges will be of a similar quality, and they'll be similarly lovely to stitch. It'll just depend whether you like their colours or not. And you're particularly going to use this for crewel embroidery. And crewel embroidery is just the same embroidery as you can do with stranded cotton. It's just called crewel embroidery because it's stitched with wool instead. But anything that you can do with your stranded cotton, you can do with the wool, and then that turns it into a crewel embroidery. You can do modern crewel embroidery, which just means it's a more of a modern, less traditional pattern or a less traditional design. But then you can do what's called Jacobean crewel work, and that's sort of in the style of what was in the 15 and 1600s, and we still do that today, and it's really lovely. And so that's what these would be used for. So not only can you get DMC, Anchor, Appletons, but there are definitely independent companies out there selling their wools as well. And also, these are quite likely to be found in thrift shops. I see kits all the time where people have probably been clearing out someone's stash, and you see a half-done tapestry or a half-done cushion kit. They're always worth buying because you'll get the threads that are inside, and maybe you can do something with the fabric even if you don't have to want to do the design that's in it. It's the fact that you're going to get all those wools. That's the thing. So these ones are actually vintage, they're Penelope. You have very vintage ones like these, and they're very, very fine. If you find anything like this, I would say definitely get it. Don't discount it at all. They embroider so beautifully, and they are super fine. So here you can see the difference between the threads, and they have changed over the years. This is the very vintage one, it's very fine. This is the vintage Penelope, which I think is probably from the 60s or 70s. And then this is a modern Appletons. And they're getting thicker over time. I love this fine one, mind. It stitches like a dream. But they all do. And if you find anything like that, grab it because they're absolutely worth it. So, we've covered fabric, needles, threads, sort of set. You don't need much else. So the next thing you're going to probably want to have are a pair of embroidery scissors. Now the ones you see around are mainly shaped like a stalk, and they've been associated with embroidery for a very long time. They didn't originate as embroidery or sewing scissors. They were originally used to clamp the umbilical cord when babies were born. So they were used by midwives, and that is why they're shaped like a stalk, because the stalks were always associated with bringing babies. That's the history of how our embroidery scissors came to be shaped like a stalk. I actually don't have any. I got myself a new pair of embroidery scissors and gave my stalk ones to my daughter, and so she has them. And so when I went looking for these, I was going particularly to a needlework shop. I took some fabric with me and I asked them whether I could cut with them, whether I could cut some threads, and they said yes, that was no problem. And I tried out the pairs of scissors in the shop, and these were the ones that I felt were nice, and they've been marvellous. So these are the ones you'll see me sewing with all the time, and there's no company, or I don't know whose they are, but if you're able to try them out, try them out. Otherwise, a nice pair of stalk scissors will probably only cost you about a £5 or something, and obviously they can be a lot more expensive than that if you desire and are able to pay for them. You can get them to an absolute fortune, but you do sort of want to have a nice pair with long sharp points so you can get into little spaces and take the thread ends off right close to your fabric without the risk of cutting something else. So a nice pair of embroidery scissors is useful. The last thing on my list of equipment that is nice to have, you don't necessarily need it, are embroidery hoops. Now, not everybody likes to use a hoop. I like to use them, and I also like to stitch in my hand. So I'll talk about stitching in a hoop or stitching in hand, and there are differences to it. These are the hoops that I have, and I don't have any others. This is all I've got. And hoops are useful for not only doing your embroidery in. These days people actually just keep them in a hoop and then use that as the frame, and they look lovely. But mainly these are for stretching your fabric. Your hoops are normally, or always used to be, made in beech wood. They have 2 rings, one fitting inside another. The outer one has usually a brass screw that's onto the top, by which you can untighten and tighten, dependent on what thickness of fabric you have in there. When you're stretching your fabric, you're always putting over the bottom one, and you can wind fabric around the bottom hoop, and it protects the top material better. You press your outer hoop down over the top and you tighten up. Now that's not going to be stretched good enough at all, so you need to have your hoop, your fabric needs to be stretched enough that it's not going to deform when you're pulling your needle through and maybe pulling tight stitches. And the fabric should be square on the hoop. You don't want wiggly lines, so take a note of the weave of the fabric and make sure that the weave is straight. Oh, that hoop is nicely done now. It's got a bit of a tension to it. The weave is straight and straight across, and that's going to be able to stitch nice, and you can hold it in your hand and stitch with one hand up and going down like that and stitch like I know a lot of slow stitch is just done in your hand. It's lovely. There's nothing, I like to do that just the same, but some embroidery stitches actually need the fabric stretched in the hoop, especially if you're doing long satin stitches. You wouldn't be able to get the same effect if you're just trying to do it in your hand. The risk is you'll either be too slack or too tight, and if you're too tight, the fabric's going to be puckered, and if you're too loose, the stitches aren't going to lie properly. So for those times you definitely would need the hoop. Now once you've decided that you do like working with a hoop, there are a couple of other things that you might feel that you want to have a try out of, and that is embroidery hoop stands. Now the one that I've had for many years, I just don't use it much anymore, is one of these, which is called a chair hoop. The hoop has a flexible stalk that you can fix wherever you want. The stalk fits into there, which you can then fix as well. The main thing is that this bit here fits under your leg, so when you're sitting in a chair, it's supporting your hoop to be at an angle that means you don't have to hold it in your hand, and so that leaves both hands free to stitch one hand on top, one hand on the bottom. I'll show you how it works. Now there are a couple of ways that you can have these. This one I've just pushed it underneath my thigh while I'm sitting in a chair, and then you can tighten this at the height that you want and also the angle, so it leaves one hand on top, one hand on the bottom. I like it anchored in between my knees, and then I turn the hoop away from me and angle it up towards me. And so the hoop is held like that, and again I've got one hand on the top and one hand on the bottom, and they're very comfortable. You can just put them on whichever side of you like, or put it in the middle. It is up to you, but they're not hugely expensive, and they do make a difference by freeing up a hand that would have been holding the hoop. Now the last thing that I can show you here is the stand that I use now. This one is metal and it has a clamp for the hoop and also a little bar going out to the side where I attach a magnifying lamp. This is the clamp for the hoop, and your hoop, whatever size, just goes in there, and then the little clamp underneath just tightens up, and then your hoop's secure. And then I can angle it at whatever angle suits me, and then I can fasten it there so that the hoop's held at the right level. And then this bit here is called a lighting bar. It actually has another couple of holes in it, but I use this end one here to put my magnifying lamp in. That just fits into there and the clamp tightens up. And then you can position the light and the magnifier exactly where you need it to embroider the best. And so I absolutely love it. It's been a boon, and the fact that the ring light has doubled as my camera light is marvellous. That's how mostly you see me embroider. I hope that's been a helpful video for you. I know I'm being constantly asked about equipment, threads, what I use, what's worth getting, what's not. Especially if you're starting out, it can be confusing. And there's lots of things where people say, you must have this, you must have that. Basically, you just need some fabric, a needle and some thread to put in it. And at its most basic, that is all you need. Everything else is just extra. And if you've enjoyed this and you're new to my channel, by all means have a look around and see what else I've been doing. And if you've been following along to the stitch journal, I hope you didn't mind me taking a week where I did a bit of an explanation, but it's been on my mind for a while to do this video, and it seemed an opportune moment to do it. So thank you very much everyone for watching and for your support across my channel, all your comments. Let me know whether you have been thinking about getting into embroidery, or if you're already there, if you have any of these things, or whether you've been thinking about getting a chair hoop or a floor stand. They're nice to have, but you definitely don't need them if you're just starting out. And I look forward to you joining me again when I'm back in here in Marion's World. Thanks everyone.